Have you ever reached the end of a day and realized without alarm, without drama, that you had not once, not even for a single moment, thought of God? Have you ever knelt to pray and felt nothing, not resistance, not consolation, not even conflict, just an interior room that had gone quiet in a way that quietly frightened you? And somewhere beneath that quiet, have you ever wondered if the fire you once carried was still there at all, or whether it had simply gone out while you were busy with everything else? There was a soldier once brilliant, vain, courageous in the way that young men are who have never truly suffered, and a cannonball tore through his leg at the Battle of Pamplona. He fell, and as he lay in a bed he could not leave, unable to move, unable to perform the life he had built around himself, something unexpected happened. God began to speak, not in thunder, not in visions, but in the difference he noticed between one feeling and another. The difference between warmth that lasted and pleasure that evaporated, between peace and its absence. That soldier became Ignatius of Loyola, and what he learned in that bed, what he tested, refined, wrote down, and gave to the Church, is one of the most precise maps of the spiritual life ever drawn, including this, that souls grow cold, that coldness is not a failure of love, and that God who made you knows exactly how to wake you back up. Subscribe, because your spiritual fire matters, and this channel exists to fan it. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with peace. You know the one. It is not the silence of a chapel before dawn, when something holy is pressing against the air. It is not the silence of a forest after rain, when every leaf holds its breath in a hush that feels almost reverential. It is the silence of a room where something used to live, and the absence is louder than the presence ever was. That is what a cold soul sounds like from the inside. And the terrifying thing, the thing that Ignatius understood with a precision that should unsettle us, is that you can arrive at this silence slowly, without drama, without a single decisive moment of betrayal. One morning you pray with feeling. The next morning a little less. A week passes, a month, and one day you are going through the motions of a spiritual life, attending Mass, saying the Rosary, crossing yourself at meals while inside, something has dimmed. You are doing all the right things, and feeling almost nothing at all. Ignatius called this state desolation, but his word should not be confused with despair, or with crisis, or with theological doubt in the formal sense. Desolation, as he described it from his own experience, and Ignatius always wrote from experience before he wrote in theory, is the experience of interior dryness, heaviness, a drawing away from things of God toward things of the world, not through dramatic temptation, but through a slow gravitational drift, as though the soul had simply lost interest in what used to make it alive. He did not diagnose this coldness as punishment. That is the first thing to hear. The soul that has grown cold has not necessarily sinned its way there. Some souls are led into desolation by God himself, for reasons that have more to do with purification than with judgment. Some arrive there through neglect, not malicious abandonment, but the ordinary forgetting that happens when life fills up and prayer quietly shrinks. And some arrive through the accumulation of small compromises, the prayer shortened, the examination of conscience skipped, the scripture left unopened for days that became weeks, that became a season of absence so gradual it seemed to have no beginning. But none of these paths leads to a God who has turned away. Here is what Ignatius knew. What he wrote with quiet urgency in the rules for discernment in the spiritual exercises, in desolation, God does not move. The soul moves. Or rather, the soul loses the felt sense of that movement and mistakes the absence of feeling for the absence of God. There is a difference, and it matters more than almost anything you will hear today. Think of it this way. You have been in a room with someone you love, and at some point the conversation has lulled, and both of you have been quiet for a while, not because the love has gone, but because you are simply there, together, without the need for speech. And then something has startled you into wondering whether they are still there. You turn, and they are there. They have been there the whole time, watching, waiting. God does not vacate the soul, but the soul can forget to look. Ignatius knew this from his bed in Loyola, where he had lain for weeks recovering from a wound that would never fully heal. He had nothing to do but feel. And what he noticed, and this is one of the great gifts he gave to everyone who has ever sat with a dry or cold interior, is that feelings could be read, that consolation and desolation were not random weather, that there was a pattern, that someone was moving behind the pattern. In that bed, with a leg that ached and books that were not the novels he had wanted, something began to happen. He read. He reflected. He noticed that when he dwelt on things of God, on Christ, on the saints, a certain peace remained after the thought had passed. It did not evaporate. It settled. But when he dwelt on his old life, the honors, the adventure, the worldly ambitions, there was pleasure in the thinking. And then, when the thought passed, a residue of something flat, something hollow. He wrote about this moment as the beginning of discernment. He had not been looking for God. He had simply been paying attention to what he felt, and God had met him exactly there, in the boredom of recovery, in the involuntary silence of a broken man who had run out of distractions. That is where he meets you too. Not in the extraordinary moment you have been waiting for, not in the revival, the retreat, the experience someone else described to you that made you think, when that happens to me, I will know I am loved. But in the ordinary texture of a day, when you sit still long enough to notice the difference between one feeling and another, between the peace that settles and the pleasure that evaporates. Your cold soul is not invisible to God. It is, in fact, the exact place He is looking, and there is something He wants you to hear before He wakes you. He has been here the whole time. You are the one who stopped listening. And He is not angry about that. He is the one who waited. The first movement of awakening is rarely what we expect. We imagine it as warmth, a rush of feeling, a return of tears in prayer, some unmistakable sense of God pressing close. We wait for the revival, for the breakthrough, for the moment we can point to and say, there. That is when I came back. That is when the fire returned. But Ignatius described something more subtle, and in the end, more reliable. He wrote in his autobiography, which he dictated in the third person, as though the story were too raw to claim directly, as though he were describing someone else to protect himself from the pride of having been chosen, that the movements he noticed at Loyola were not great floods of light. They were small differences, small shifts in the temperature of his interior, and it was precisely because they were small that he nearly missed them. This is how God typically works in a soul that has grown cold. Not with flood, but with thaw. Think of how ice melts not in a single dramatic event, but in degrees so gradual that you cannot find the moment it stopped being ice and became water. And yet at some point, it is water. It is moving again. And you realize, looking back, that you have been watching a resurrection happen too slowly to see. Ignatius gave the Church a tool for this, the examen, the daily examination of conscience that is not, as it is sometimes misunderstood, a list of sins to audit before sleep. It is something far more generous than that. It is a practice of awareness of asking, at the end of each day, where was I moved today? Where did I feel close to something real? Where did I feel far? Where did something in me resist? And where did something in me open? You do not need a retreat to do this. You do not need a spiritual director, a chapel, an hour of silence, or a particular gift for prayer. You need 5 minutes, and the willingness to look honestly at the interior weather of a single day. And this is the thing about a soul that has grown cold. It often resists even this, not through conscious rebellion, but through the very inertia of coldness. Cold things do not want to move. Cold things resist the first touch of warmth. And so the examen, this small, humble, 5-minute practice that Ignatius considered essential, feels like too much. Feels like effort. Feels like a demand you cannot meet on a day that has already taken everything you had. Ignatius knew this too. He wrote in the spiritual exercises in the rules for navigating desolation that in times of spiritual dryness, one must not make great changes. Do not rearrange your entire prayer life. Do not undertake new penances or new ambitious structures of devotion that you did not maintain before the dryness came. Instead, hold the form. Keep the small things. Light the candle even if you feel nothing when you light it. Say the prayer even when your mouth forms the words alone and your heart seems to be elsewhere entirely. This is not hypocrisy. It is something more like fidelity. And fidelity, the kind that continues, even when it receives nothing visible in return, is what God is watching for. Not because he is testing your endurance the way a cold teacher tests a reluctant student, but because fidelity is the shape love takes when feeling has temporarily gone. It is love, without the luxury of feeling like love. There is a woman you may know, or you may be her, who gets up every morning and prays the same prayer she has prayed for 20 years. And most mornings it feels like nothing, like speaking into a wall that does not move. And she prays anyway, not because she is heroic, not because she has conquered spiritual dryness or arrived at some elevated state, but because somewhere beneath the feeling, or beneath the absence of feeling, she has decided something. She has decided that God is real, whether she feels him or not, and she acts from that decision rather than from the shifting weather of her emotion. Ignatius would say, this is not a small thing. This is everything, because the soul that prays in dryness is doing something the soul in consolation does not have to do. It is choosing God without the reward of consolation. It is loving without the comfort of feeling loved in return. And this specific act, repeated day after day in the quiet, is what shapes the soul into something durable, something that can be trusted with more. God wakes the cold soul, in part, by watching what it does with the cold. The examen, practiced in dryness, becomes a kind of spiritual archaeology. You sit at the end of a day that felt like nothing, and you ask, where was God moving when I could not feel it? And you begin to find things, a moment of unexpected patience, a kindness that came from somewhere outside yourself, a scripture verse that surfaced in your mind during a difficult conversation, unbidden, exactly right. A peace that settled after a decision you were afraid to make. Small things, but they were not random. They were the movements of a God who has not left, who has, in fact, been more active in your dry season than in any season of felt consolation, because consolation is given by God, partly as gift, and partly as sustenance for the road ahead. But desolation, the true desolation that Ignatius named and mapped, is not punishment. It is preparation. It is the field being cleared. It is the pruning that must happen before any new growth becomes possible. You are not being abandoned. You are being made ready. And the first thing readiness requires is the willingness to remain in the silence, in the dryness, with the candle lit and the prayer spoken and the heart held open, even when it does not feel like it is receiving anything at all. Hold it open, because something is coming through, whether you feel it or not. And what comes through a soul that has held itself open in the cold is something that cannot afterward be taken away. There is something Ignatius wrote near the end of the spiritual exercises in the section called The Contemplation to Attain Love, that contains the whole of what the cold soul needs to hear. He invites the retreatant to consider how God dwells in all things, in the elements, in the plants, in the animals, in the human person giving being, life, sensation, understanding, and then laboring, as Ignatius put it, laboring on our behalf, like someone who works without ceasing, not in order to be seen, but because he cannot stop, because it is his nature to give. Because giving is not something God does, it is something God is. God is not resting while your soul feels cold. He is laboring in you, even now, even in the stillness that feels like absence, even in the grey flatness of a week in which no prayer seemed to land. He is doing something, building, preparing, waiting with a particular patience of someone who knows the end of the story and is not afraid of the middle. This is the God Ignatius met in the wreckage of his ambitions. Not the God of vague consolation, not an abstract warmth offering occasional good feelings, but a God who entered his boredom, his pain, his thwarted plans, and began to speak in the language of felt difference, who showed him, through the alternation of warmth and flatness, that he was present, attentive, and actively communicating through the very texture of interior life. You have access to the same God, the same language, the same interior movements, waiting to be read. And if your soul has grown cold, if you are somewhere in the long middle of a dryness that has no dramatic story, no single moment of betrayal, just the slow dimming that happens when life gets busy and prayer gets thin and God somehow becomes the thing you will get back to then, there is something Ignatius would tell you now. Something he wrote to friends who were struggling. Something said with the authority of a man who had sat in that cold himself and come out the other side, carrying something he could not have carried otherwise. Do not be troubled by your state. Return. Begin again. The door is not closed. It has never been closed. It is open. And here is what beginning again looks like, not the idealized version, not the retreat-worthy version, but the version available to you today, in the ordinary material of your actual life. It looks like a single honest prayer, not eloquent, not impressive, something like, I am cold, I do not feel you, I am here anyway. It looks like the examen, done imperfectly for 5 minutes before sleep, asking not whether you were good today, but where God was moving today, and whether you noticed, and what you might notice tomorrow if you were watching for it. It looks like returning to a single scripture passage, not a reading program, not a commitment to chapter and verse, but one verse that once meant something, held gently, the way you hold a photograph of someone you love when they are far away. And it looks like patience with yourself, because Ignatius, who understood the human soul with rare precision, knew this. The soul that condemns itself for its coldness only sinks deeper into cold. Self-attack is not a spiritual strategy. It is despair dressed in the clothes of zeal. The soul that says, I should not have let this happen. I should have been better. I should have prayed more, and then spirals inward rather than turning outward toward God, has been caught by exactly what desolation loves: paralysis. You are not required to be ashamed of your coldness. You are required only to return. Ignatius held this conviction at the center of his spirituality. The soul is made for God, and the movement back toward God, however faltering, however incomplete, however unceremonious, is the movement the soul was always meant to make. Not the grand return, not the dramatic conversion, the small return, the daily one, the one made on an ordinary morning in the kitchen before the coffee has finished brewing, with a single word offered into the silence. God, I am here. That is enough. It has always been enough. And here is the fire Ignatius discovered in his own long recovery. It was not something he had to generate. It was already there, buried beneath the ash of his former life, waiting for someone to clear away what was covering it. The wound at Pamplona was not the obstacle to his sanctity. It was the condition of it. The very thing that laid him flat was the thing that made him stop performing long enough to feel the difference between life and almost life. Your coldness is not your enemy. It is the invitation. Not because suffering or dryness is good in itself, Ignatius never said that, and the Church has never taught that, but because the cold, faced honestly, leads somewhere. It leads to the examen, to the return, to the prayer that begins without feeling and continues without reward, and sometimes not always, not on demand, but sometimes opens into something that can only be described as presence, unmistakable, quiet, real, and when that presence comes, when the warmth returns, as it will, as it always does, because God is faithful, even when we have forgotten how to look, you will carry something you did not have before. You will carry the knowledge that He was there in the cold, that the silence was not empty. That fidelity in dryness is its own form of union, perhaps the deepest form, because it is love, without the luxury of feeling like love. Ignatius called this consolation, without prior cause. The gift God gives not as reward for your effort, but as tenderness for your perseverance. The fire that returns not because you stoked it perfectly, but because you did not abandon the hearth. The fire is already yours. It has not gone out. It has only been waiting for you to come back to the room where it burns. Come back. Come back today. Come back in the small way. Come back with whatever is true right now. He is already there. You are still here. That is not a small thing. In a world built to pull your attention in 17 directions at once, to fill every silence, scroll over every stillness, replace every quiet moment, with something louder you stayed. You listened, all the way through. And if something in what you heard today touched something real in you, if a word landed somewhere you were not expecting, that is not coincidence. This channel exists for exactly this, the soul that is still searching, still returning, still keeping the candle lit even when the wax is low. We make these reflections with care, with hours of reading, writing, and attention to theology, because we believe that your interior life matters, that your spiritual health is not a luxury, that your relationship with God deserves something more than noise. If this channel has given you something, if these words have been companions in a dry season, or a quiet Sunday afternoon, or a moment when you needed to remember that the fire was still there, then consider becoming a member. Your support allows this work to continue. It allows these reflections to go deeper, reach further, and serve more souls who are sitting in their own cold rooms, wondering if God is still close. He is. We will keep telling you so. Come and be covered too.